Many years ago, during a crisp autumn season, my parents surprised me with the news that we were going camping. Even better, they allowed me to bring a friend along. I couldn't contain my excitement, as I knew this trip was bound to be a blast. When the long-awaited weekend finally arrived, my parents and I, accompanied by my friend, set off into the mountains for our camping adventure. It was just a one-night trip, but for a schoolboy like me, it felt like an eternity of joy. This was back in the day when outdoor camping wasn't as popular as it is today. As we reached the campsite, we were taken aback by the absence of any other campers in sight. I have to admit, it felt a bit lonely at first, but that feeling quickly dissipated. I saw the campsite as our own private playground, and we wasted no time exploring the nearby river and the woods. As evening approached, we gathered around a campfire and enjoyed a hearty barbecue. It was truly a great time. However, just before bedtime, my friend's mood took a sudden nosedive. He was usually a bundle of self-confidence, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, his spirits seemed to dwindle. He began to feel homesick and frightened. Eventually, through tear-filled eyes, he confessed that he wanted to go back home. By then, it was too late. My parents had already indulged in some drinks, and we were getting ready to hit the hay. We retired to our tent, the sounds of the forest enveloping us. It was pretty spooky out there in the wild, but we managed to drift off to sleep without any issues. The following morning, we decided to head back home earlier than planned because my friend was clearly distressed. We left while it was still dark outside, and I can't recall the exact time, but it felt like everyone wanted to escape that place as soon as possible. Upon our return home, my parents headed to their bedroom, claiming they were going to take a nap. I heard a lot of commotion coming from upstairs, despite their supposed nap. It was still early in the morning, and I was quite tired. I nodded off while sitting on the sofa, watching morning cartoons. My slumber was interrupted by the ringing of the house phone. Back then, we didn't have caller ID displays, so I had no idea who was calling. I secretly hoped it would be Grandpa. Strangely, my parents showed no interest in answering the call, leaving it to ring incessantly. Frustrated, I decided to pick it up. "Good morning," I greeted the caller. The voice on the other end belonged to a girl I couldn't immediately recognize. Based on my recollection, she sounded about my age, or maybe it was an older woman with a youngish-sounding voice. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed plausible because I hadn't shared my home phone number with any of my classmates. I remained silent for a while, just listening. The caller continued, "Camp was fun last night. The barbecue was really great too, especially the shrimp. I had a good laugh when your usually cheeky and confident friend started tearing up because he was homesick." I still kept quiet, but my drowsiness was wearing off, and something felt off. How could someone know so much about our camping trip? Only the four of us had been at the campsite. I couldn't answer that question, so I decided to ask the mysterious person on the other end. After a silence that felt like a shocked pause, I received an answer I hadn't expected. "Because we were together the entire time." With that statement, I heard a click, and the line went dead. I was truly freaked out at this point, but my immediate thought was that my friend had played a prank on me. I quickly called him, but he denied telling anyone about our camping trip, except his parents. He was so embarrassed by his homesick episode that he hadn't even mentioned it to them. When my parents finally came downstairs after their nap or whatever they were doing, I asked them if they had given out our phone number or shared details about our camping trip with anyone. They both insisted that they hadn't told a soul, except for the person who had reserved our campsite. In the end, I hope it was just a prank and nothing more. But a strange feeling lingers, as if we were being watched that night in the woods. I can't forget those last haunting words on the phone, because we were together the entire time. When I was in elementary school, I had the chance to go on a camping trip during summer vacation. The school organized the trip, and it was a 2-night adventure at a campsite located about 2 hours from the nearest town. While it was technically a campsite, it wasn't very well maintained. It had a kitchen and a bathroom, which was a relief because it meant we weren't just living in tents. However, the whole place had a dated and somewhat shabby vibe. The bathroom was more like an outhouse, located quite a distance from the campsite. Our campsite was nestled close to some swampland, and on the other side, there was a cliff. Even as a kid, I remember thinking that this wasn't the safest place for a camping trip. We had a range of activities available, from hiking and fishing during the day to campfires and daring challenges at night. These nighttime dares, or tests of courage, were created by the teachers. They weren't usually very intense, but this one was different. The dare I took up on the first night went like this: go into the woods at night without a flashlight, alone, and stay there for a while. There were rules, too. If you started running or screaming, you'd alert wild animals, and potentially become one of the kids who go missing in these mountains. At the time, I thought it was just a way for the teachers to make it fun for us. Looking back on it, it does seem a bit strange that we were instructed to stand in the woods in complete darkness and silence until a teacher came to get us. Despite my reluctance, I went along with the dare. After all, I was far from home and deep in the mountains. I was a pretty obedient kid, so I followed the teachers and their flashlights into the heart of the woods. It was so dark, and all I could hear were the sounds of insects and the trees swaying gently. We reached what I assumed was the designated spot, and then the teachers turned off their flashlights and walked away, leaving me in total darkness. I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed, it was that dark. The air was thick and warm, sticking to my skin. I heard the occasional rustle of bushes and the calls of some unknown animal in the distance. It was hard to determine if it was close or far away. I wasn't out there for more than 5 minutes, but those moments felt incredibly long. I felt completely isolated. Then, out of nowhere, the flashlights returned, and I felt relieved. I wasn't alone anymore. We all headed back to the campsite together, and the teachers joked about how lucky we were not to see anything creepy that year. I joined in on the laughter, feeling brave and mature. The rest of the night was uneventful, but the next day, I noticed that my friend, who had taken the same dare as me, seemed frightened. She was gazing toward the cliffs, and when I asked her what was wrong, she said, "Can't you see them?" I looked, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just a flowing stream down below. My friend, however, looked on the verge of tears. "The kids with red faces down there, can't you see them?" She kept saying she could see a girl and a boy, but I couldn't see anything. The teachers and I couldn't understand what she was talking about. We tried to console her, but it seemed like no one else could see what she saw. As the day went on, we all got distracted, and my friend's strange experience faded into the background. The night that followed was, for the most part, uneventful. But, as I was on the verge of sleep in my cozy sleeping bag, I heard whispers and excitement from the other kids in the tent. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted from excitement to tension, and I saw 2 girls leaning over another girl who was sitting on the floor, complaining of pain. She said she felt crushed, and as we watched in horror, she folded, her chin almost touching the floor. It was as if something heavy was on her back, and she cried and screamed in agony. Panic swept through the tent. The teachers rushed in, one of them carrying a bottle of salt. They sprinkled it around and started hitting the girl's back with their palms. Miraculously, she stopped crying and screaming, as if nothing had happened. It was a baffling and terrifying experience. After that incident, the trip continued without further unusual events. We returned home safely on the bus, but the memories of that strange camping trip lingered. I talked to my friends from other groups, and some of them shared different eerie experiences, like seeing unknown kids in the darkness or humanoid shadows. I can't remember why I wanted to go on that trip in the first place. It feels like a hazy, half-remembered memory, a journey into a liminal space that left a lasting impression on all of us who were there. The mountains, as I learned, can be a truly unusual and mysterious place. I've always had a strong aversion to camping. My parents sent me to summer camp in Colorado every year, and each session included at least one camping trip. Despite these excursions being relatively short, I resented them deeply. I loathed the heavy backpack, the lack of proper toilets, and the inevitable spiders that managed to infiltrate my tent. However, my perspective on camping briefly changed when I turned 16 and became a camp counselor. As a counselor in training, we were given considerable freedom and responsibility. Most nights, we had to stay in the cabin with our campers, but there were rumors that the camping trip was when the older counselors let loose, drinking, smoking, and enjoying themselves once all the campers were asleep. Little did I know that the events of that particular camping trip would forever deter me from venturing into the woods. The trip started like any other. There were about 30 of us, 4 counselors in training, 4 counselors, and approximately 20 boys and girls aged 13 to 14. We trekked along single file through various trails, the conversations and laughter of the campers drowning out the sounds of nature. Several hours passed as we trudged through a marshy area and up a steep incline, surrounded by dense evergreens and aspens. I was not the most athletic kid, so I found myself lagging behind with another counselor in training named Jordan and 2 campers who were also struggling to keep up. As we chatted, we gradually fell further and further behind the rest of the group until they disappeared around a bend, leaving us out of view. Unconcerned at first, we continued walking at our slow pace. However, the trail began to level off, and I began to feel increasingly uneasy. Not only had we lost sight of the rest of the group, but we had also entered a section of dead evergreens, half of which appeared scorched by a wildfire and the other half consumed by disease. The eerie landscape was punctuated by a small, run-down cabin nestled in the scorched forest, seemingly untouched by the fire that had swept through the area. We were captivated by the scene, but our fascination was broken when one of the campers screamed at the sound of a twig snapping behind us. Startled, we turned to see a haggard-looking man with wild black hair and a long beard slowly approaching us, his eyes locked on us. He had no hiking gear, and we had no clue how long he'd been following us. We were naturally quite unnerved, but Jordan managed to offer the man a cautious wave. When Jordan turned to ask the man to repeat himself, the man muttered, "Going camping?" Jordan replied, "Yes, we're going camping," to which the man smiled ominously and added, "Better be careful." We nodded and muttered a half-hearted thank you before quickening our pace to catch up with the rest of the group, this time walking considerably faster. To our surprise, the man didn't continue following but instead stood still in the middle of the trail, watching us as we disappeared from his sight. Finally, we reached the rest of the group, who had been waiting for us, and we shared the details of our encounter with the adult supervisor. They shrugged it off, suggesting that the man probably lived in the cabin and just wanted to know what we were doing on his property. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that the man might have somehow followed us. Once we arrived at the campsite, I managed to put the unsettling encounter out of my mind and enjoyed the rest of the evening. After everyone had gone to bed, Jordan and another counselor in training sneaked out 2 warm drinks they had pilfered from the counselors' quarters to avoid getting in trouble. We decided to hike into the woods to have a smoke. We made our way to the river's edge, where we had washed our pots and pans earlier that day. The spot was eerily silent, and thoughts of the man we had encountered earlier kept creeping into my mind. After a while, We returned to our tents, pitched slightly away from the others, and discreetly sipped on our drinks while sharing scary camping stories. Time passed, and one of the boys started telling a story he seemed to be making up on the spot when he suddenly halted. In the silence, we heard what sounded like footsteps on pine needles, approximately 40 feet away near one of the other campers' tents. We strained to listen, but the noises ceased. Though we assumed it was just one of the other campers heading to the bathroom, our nerves were on edge from the scary stories. We decided to call it a night and retreated to our tents. I woke up to the distinct sound of footsteps outside my tent, my heart racing. I tried to stay as still as possible and control my breathing. The footsteps were clearly just a few feet away from the front of my tent, and it seemed like someone was pacing back and forth. I turned to wake up Jordan, but I was relieved to see he was already in the tent with me. Assuming Jordan was the one I had heard outside, I closed my eyes, trying to calm my racing heart. Just as I was beginning to drift back to sleep, I realized I needed to use the bathroom. I muttered something about it and unzipped my sleeping bag. Annoyed by the noise, Jordan turned over, pulling his hoodie up over his head before going still. As quietly as possible, I unzipped the tent, put on my shoes, and began making my way across the campsite to the designated bathroom area. I had just reached the spot and was preparing to relieve myself when I heard rustling coming from our campsite. It sounded as if someone was rummaging through our supplies and bags. Still slightly groggy and on edge from the scary stories, I tried to pull up my pants hastily and lost my balance, grabbing a branch that produced a loud snapping noise. I tried to regain my composure as quietly as possible, but when I finally managed to look up, I saw a figure moving toward me, across our campsite. Before I could even think, I was blinded by the bright light of a flashlight shining directly into my eyes, and the light was growing closer. Frozen and panicked, the figure approached within 10 feet of me. Then, I heard Jordan's voice, "Sorry, it's just me." I breathed a sigh of relief, but Jordan asked me something that sent shivers down my spine. "Have you seen my blue hoodie? I think one of the campers might have stolen it from my bag while I was sleeping." After a brief pause, I stuttered, "But you were just wearing it when you got back in the tent." What he said next chilled me to the bone. "What are you talking about? It's been missing since we got back from the river. I even went down there to check if I left it behind by accident, and I couldn't find it. I thought I checked the boys' bags, and that's when I saw you." The realization struck me like a lightning bolt. The man who had entered the tent with me moments earlier wasn't Jordan. Sensing that something was wrong, Jordan asked for an explanation. I managed to get out that someone had stolen his hoodie and was sleeping in our tent. Jordan was skeptical, so we went back to our tent to investigate. As we approached the tent, Jordan flipped on his flashlight and shone it through the nylon lining. He let out a high-pitched scream. We both saw a clear silhouette of a man's shadow lying still inside our tent. We ran to the neighboring tents, where the older counselors were sleeping, and frantically unzipped their tent, yelling for them to come out and informing them that there was an intruder in our tent. Panic set in as our counselor groggily woke up, but after some frantic yelling, they grasped the severity of the situation. A commotion broke out on the other side of the camp near our tent, and by the time the counselors reached the scene, they only found an unzipped tent and our belongings scattered on the ground, evidence of the intruder's escape. The counselors radioed back to the camp to call the police, and it was clear they were as frightened as we were. None of us could sleep after that. Fortunately, we only had to wait a few hours for the sun to rise. As the day broke, a few other counselors arrived with guns to escort us back to the camp. During our descent, one of the campers discovered Jordan's sweater tied to a tree on the path, like some kind of marker. Needless to say, Jordan had no interest in retrieving it, and we left it behind. To this day, I can't be certain if the man in our tent was the same one we encountered on the trail earlier, but his face and that night still haunt me.